A very good afternoon, dear students, and welcome to lecture 4, part 3, which is looking into ecological principles. So now remember how we covered 12 different ecological concepts, out of which the first 7 was general, and the remaining ones were tools in order to help manage the other ecological concepts. So now when it comes to principles, is a combination of some of these ecological concepts in order to achieve the following ecological principles. So we have about 5 different principles that you want to cover. These are the 5 that we're talking about, and we will go through one by one. So for the first ecological principle, we're talking about how does one help protect species. So it's about protection of species and the subdivisions, meaning to say like subspecies, and the ways we conserve genetic diversity. So for recap, EP1 looks into ecological concept 1, which is levels of biological organization, and EC4 population viability, the one that looks into at the rate example of whales that were going into to particular threats, and then having to have a prediction model to show that if anthropogenic activities will increase, how will it look like in a projection of 100 years to come, and how it is if it's higher, and what it is if it's no anthropogenic threats at all. Okay, so the points that you want to look at is for this one first. So at the population level, the processes are ultimately genetic and evolutionary because these maintains the potential for continued existence of species and their adaptation to changing conditions. So in a way, if you're looking at the populations of the overall ecosystem, it is important because we need to look into the genetic diversity and the evolution that happens over time. And this can happen if you have an ecosystem that is well sustained. Okay, so in most instances, managing for genetic diversity directly is impractical and difficult to implement. Yes, if you want to look at genetic diversity and if you want to manage it in a lab scale, it's always very easy. But when you're talking about ecosystems, especially if it's ecosystems that are ever changing, it's always more difficult to look into that. Okay, so the most credible surrogate or alternative for sustaining genetic variability is 1, maintaining not only the species, 2, but also the spatial structure of genetic variation within species. So you're not looking into just the species level of maintenance, but also the subspecies. So for a good example, like I will give you a terrestrial example, yeah, if you're looking at, say, tigers. So you have tigers, but those that are technically you have 9 different tigers that at least we have known. Out of which 3 were now considered extinct, but they are very endemic to the certain locality, like the Javanese tiger, the Siberian tiger, the Malayan tiger. So that is why it's not just about maintaining the species itself, but you're talking about looking into subspecies. And then maintenance of this population distributed across a species' natural range will assist in conserving genetic variability. So this ensures that continuation of locally adapted genetic variants. Retaining a variety of individuals and species permits the adaptability needed to sustain ecosystem productivity in changing environments and can also beget further diversity. Species that are collapsing towards the edge of their range, if for example, if you're looking into this kind of projection model, so if species are collapsing towards the edge of their range and disjunct population, where a local population is disconnected from the continuous range of their species, are also particularly important to consider, given that climate change can also be an issue towards their productivity. And in order to, and because of that, we want we actually have to look into conserving genetic diversity and also ensure that there will be continuous adaptation rather than they going through any more further threats. So the second part that we'll be looking at is ecological principle 2, which is maintaining habitat is fundamental to conserving the species. So we were looking initially at the population level because the population level looks into, okay, for the genetic diversity, but is that genetic diversity that needs to be conserved on the habitat level. So hence, habitat level again still looks into levels of biological organization because say if that species is very endemic to that area, obviously you want to look into the levels of organization as to which kind of ecosystem. And of course, that is why in a way it's also applicable to native species because kind of reflect EC1 with EC2. Which of this is native species? So those are things you have to think about. And of course, having to know because of a particular habitat may have some form of connectivity or fragmentation, like we talked about geographical differences or barriers such as this. Every ecosystem is going to have its own connectivity and fragmentation. So one has to look into that. So a species habitat, okay, looking back into habitat, is the ecosystem's condition that supports life requirements. Our understanding of the habitat is based on our knowledge of species ecology and how that determines where a species is known to occur or likely to occur. Habitat can be considered at a range of spatial and temporal scales that include very specific microsites. For example, occupied by certain invertebrates or some even lichens, or large heterogeneous habitats, or occupancy of habitat during certain time periods. For example, looking into breeding sites, winter range areas. So of course, you're going to have to also understand the native, this is why I mentioned about native species, whether or not those are its actual breeding sites or whether it is migratory or not. And therefore, conserving habitat requires a multi-scale approach from regions to landscapes to ecosystems to critical habitat elements, features, and structures. Now we go into ecological principle 3, which is large areas usually contain more species than smaller areas within similar habitat. So these looks into the four ecological concepts, which is number 4, population viability or thresholds, coarse and fine filter approach, and also protected area. So the theory, say, of island biogeography illustrates a basic principle that large area usually contains more species than small areas with similar habitat because they support larger and more viable populations. The threshold that the numbers of species of an island is determined by two factors, the distance of the mainland and also island size. Thus, this would affect the rate of extinction on the islands and the level of immigration. So and immigration will be something that Dr. Jenny will actually cover about later. Other factors being similar, including distance to the mainland, on small islands, the chance of extinction is greater than on larger ones. This is one reason why large islands can hold more species than smaller ones. In the context of applying the theory more broadly, the island can be any area of the habitat surrounded by areas unsuitable for the species on the island. So therefore, a system of areas conserved for biodiversity that includes large areas can effectively support more viable populations. So now we are looking into ecological principle 4. It's where all things are connected, but the nature and strength of those connections vary. So this looks into, again, still predominantly the levels of biological organization because we need to understand how the relationships at each level are similar or differ. And apart from having to understand the relationship, it's also looking at which of those are keystone species, like the one we talked about with the Pesester starfish. So now species, as you all would know by now, they play many different roles in communities and ecosystems, and they are connected by those roles to other species in different ways and with varying degrees of strength. For a perfect example is like the Pesester starfish. So it is important to understand key interactions. So now you remember this as key species, but don't forget we've also covered about key ecosystems and also processes. And some species have a more profound effect on ecosystem than others. So you would obviously have to identify which is which. Particular species and networks of interacting species have key broad-scale ecosystem level effects, while others don't. So the ways in which species interacts vary in addition to the strengths of those interactions. Species can act as a predator or it can even be prey. So again, it can be predator and prey or predator or prey. Or it can actually be a mutualist or a synergist. So the key issue is that it is important to determine which among the many interactions here are strong ones, because they are the ones towards which attention needs to be directed. And the last part of our ecological principle 5 is disturbances shape the characteristics of populations, communities, and ecosystem. So with the keyword disturbances, of course, it's looking into disturbances of both human and non-human based disturbances, and also connection and fragmentation. So the type, intensity, frequency, and duration of a disturbance, okay, be it natural or human intervention, they shape the characteristics of the population, the communities, and ecosystem, including their shape, size, and spatial relationships. So now natural disturbances have played a key role in forming and maintaining natural ecosystems. For example, like forest fires or tornadoes. So they influence their structures, including the size, shape, and distribution of patches. The more regions, landscapes, ecosystems, and local habitat elements resembles those that are established from natural disturbances, the greater the probability that native species and ecological processes will be maintained. So this approach can be strengthened by developing an improved understanding of how ecosystems respond to both natural and human disturbances, thus creating opportunities to build resilience in the system. By right, one can actually also include ecological resilience as well, because we need to understand how ecological resilience actually reacts towards disturbances. Okay, so for example, high frequency, low intensity fires have shaped pine ecosystems, while low frequency, high intensity fires have shaped lodgepole pine ecosystems. Okay, so maintaining this ecosystem means restoring fire and or designing management practices such as harvesting to reduce the differences between a managed landscape and a landscape pattern created by natural disturbance. Since ecosystems can change dramatically at a site level due to natural disturbances, considering their composition and structure of habitats at the landscape level may be more useful. So it is important to recognize that for some less mobile species, distribution of habitat is potentially as influential as amount of habitat. For example, the patch size or the connectivity. All right, that's all for now. Thank you very much. And if you have any questions, please contact me during the class sessions. Thank you.